In this video we're going to talk about the components and operation of the Avio TCW-215 power supply. First thing is the main power cables. These heavy duty cables right here that connect right here on the sides of the head. This is what transfers the power through the thermode. When this arrives, these will be disconnected and you'll have to make these connections, and as far as positive, minus, which side, doesn't really matter on this. This right here is the thermocouple wire that transmits the thermocouple feedback from the thermode to the power supply. And this also has the second wire on this is actually attached to a switch, which is inside the weld head right here. And the switch is what basically tells the power supply when this has been fired and achieves the correct head pressure. It's what initiates the heating cycle. There's a couple connections on the back of the power supply here. This one is the head I/O. This actually goes to the foot switch, one of these does, and the other one goes to the solenoid valve, which controls the up-down motion of the head. Right here is the main power cord that comes out, and of course this has to be wired into 220 volts AC single phase. Also on the back of the power supply here is a main breaker. Just be aware that has to be on and not tripped in order for the system to work. Okay, now we're going to talk about the functions, how to program and set the parameters on the TCW-215 power supply. First thing I want to talk about is the power range. These are actually transformer taps, and so the range that you use has to somewhat match the size of your thermode. For small thermodes, you know, you're in the 1 to 2. For large hot bars, you're in the 3, 4, and 5 range. And the way you can tell if you're in the wrong range is either A, the thermode just can't heat up quickly enough, in which case you're in too low of a range, or it overheats and basically burns up your small thermode, in which you're in too high of a power range and it can't control its temperature quickly enough. So right now, of course, the power supply is on, and what I want to talk about here is typically when you first fire it up. I'll just go through the sequence here. This is what you're going to see. It comes up to this screen, and we're going to adjust the program. So right now I'm going to click program. It says program 1, and you can see the 1 is highlighted, and if we use the plus key we can scroll up through programs 2, 3, and 4 and so on, but we're going to go back to program 1 and adjust the settings on program 1. The data set takes us to the first line item, which is your first temperature setting. You don't have to use both of these. You can set the number 2, all the values under number 2 here, to 0 and just use the first one. But this is available for when you want it, that you can raise the thermode up to a first temperature and hold it for a certain amount of time, and then you can raise it up to your final temperature and hold it for a certain amount of time. So the way this works is, this is the first set point temperature, and I have this one set at 200°C. To change it, you would use the plus or minus buttons while it's highlighted. I'm going to down arrow here. Up under number 1 is how many seconds it takes to get from room temperature to this temperature. If this is not set high enough, this thing will time out or basically trip out, meaning if it doesn't reach the temperature within the time that you set here, it's going to throw an error. HT stands for hold time, and this is how many seconds it's going to hold it at that temperature before it moves on to the second sequence. And right now I have that set at 0.1 seconds. Second sequence takes it up to 450°C. It gets there in a half a second, which is the second up time here. And HT for hold time, it holds it for 5 seconds. Now I'm only going to talk about the settings that are really critical that you have set. There's others that you can read about in the manual that have different meanings, but for now we're just going to talk about the main ones. This is program editing screen when we get into program and hit data set. In order to make this machine operational, you have to hit the operate button, and you can see here that the ready light came on when we did this. This is showing us the thermocouple feedback temperature, which this would be room temperature at this point because it's settled in here at 26 Celsius. Now there's some other settings that matter when you're running here, and let's go into parameter, which is this button right here. Squeeze time and hold time, don't really need those for this particular operation. You can read about those in the manual, what they mean. Same with rising detect and rise point. But the main one on this screen that I want to inform you of is the solid point temperature. What this means is it's the temperature at which you consider your solder to be solid. This is the temperature at which it's going to retract the head. So basically in the soldering sequence, the head comes down, brings the thermode into contact and squeezes the two parts together, heats up, holds it for a certain amount of time, and then it starts to let it cool down. Once the cool down part of the sequence hits this temperature, solid point, only then can the head retract. Assuming, of course, that you're using a pneumatic head. If you're using a manual head with a foot pedal, then you control when it retracts. Let's see here. We're going to scroll down through these and come to the second parameter page. One of the ones that matters right here is this head sequence. And your options are off or use. If you're using a pneumatic head that's fired by a solenoid, this needs to be used, because basically that turns on the head I/O to fire the solenoid. Profile detect, this has to do with detecting how closely the thermode actually matches your program profile, and it gives you a plus or minus range. If it falls out of that range, basically it's going to alarm out. You just need to know that this needs to be large enough to keep you from having errors tripped out all the time, and yet small enough to control your process. So you have to decide plus or minus how many degrees is allowable for your process. And that's the only two parameter pages. We go back to operation, and you can see the ready lights come on. Now when we fire this power supply or hit the foot pedal, and it initiates the solenoid, which fires the cylinder, lowers the head, all that, starts to heat the thermode up, it's going to go through a series of lights here while it's heating and while it's cooling when it hits solid point. And if you have any errors, of course, this error light's going to come on. One thing that would cause an error is if you turn this power supply on and you don't have the thermode properly installed, if it's shorted out somewhere, or if your thermocouples become detached, or if you forgot to plug the thermocouple in, that will cause an error. I'm going to go ahead and initiate a heating sequence here so that you can see exactly what the screen does, how it graphs the profile of the heating sequence and how the lights work. And here you see the temperature coming up to 450 and holding it for our set 5 seconds. You can see the heat button was on. Now it's starting to cool off. When it reaches, I believe 175 is where we set the solid point. You can see the solid point tripped for just a second and then back to ready, and we're good to go.